is CASELS. I am here with Doc. He's been on the ground in Ukraine for over 25 years. He's an American that is doing a phenomenal work over there, and he's been there since literally day zero. So I will hand it over to you, Doc. You're talking to me a little about the humanitarian crisis that's there and looming in eastern Ukraine, and really all of Ukraine, but particularly eastern Ukraine. If you could go into that, that'd be awesome.
Sure. The problem is multifaceted. Number one, obviously, because of the war here on the Eastern Front, the Eastern and Southeastern Front are the two remaining active areas of over 1,200 kilometers of linear front line fighting. And so because of our direct proximity to Russia, we're about 30 miles from the Russian border here out east. We had a mass population exodus, IDPs, internally displaced persons, fleeing eastern Ukraine in this area. And so the humanitarian crisis begins with the fact that because so many people have left, there are too few people left to work here, literally.
Wow.
And so there's very few stores operating. There's very few trucks coming in. And because it's easy for the West, Europe, America, to go to the border, the Polish border with Ukraine out west or the Romanian border out west, that's as far as the humanitarian stuff gets. And so it sits on the border, it sits in warehouses. And we've been trying desperately for months to try hire trucks to have stuff brought out here. Obviously, it's dangerous coming out this far, so that I understand the reluctance. And secondly, because of that situation, because there is ongoing incoming artillery, rockets, and so on, the periodic Islander cruise missile that comes in, it creates a very volatile, not secure environment, and therefore Western European humanitarian agencies, organizations, especially governmental ones, which are utterly worthless, they just don't deliver out here. And so our organization and other the limited few organizations that still exist here in the East, we are having to create our own, underground network of getting supplies brought out east and then delivering them into the remote villages that are now being liberated over the past 5 weeks of the counteroffensive that the Ukrainian military has been conducting.
Wow. How far would you say the line is from where traditional aid stops to where you all have to go? Like, what's the distance usually? Like, is it a few miles? Is it 20 miles? What's the...
Could you say that again?
Yeah, so let's say, traditional, large government, aid organizations, whatever they may be, stop delivering aid up to the front. How far past do you all go usually?
Okay, yeah. Right now, the nearest two places where there is aid available, that's either over in Poltava, which is about 110 miles due west of us, or down, there is some limited resources down in Dnepr, which is about 140, 150 miles, basically south of us from here. So those are the nearest areas, meaning that's like the end of the line as far as aid will come. And then we arrange it from there and get it brought into the Kharkov area. I won't be very specific about that. And then from there, we divide it up. We have vehicles, four-wheel drives that we load up every other day with hundreds of food bags, hygienic items, personal hygiene items, feminine hygiene items, diapers for children, diapers for adults. And we run those out into villages all through the oblast, meaning that county of Kharkov. And daily we're in villages out there that have yet to see any international aid of any kind since day one of the war.
Wow. That's incredible. So you're covering literally thousands of square miles that no one else is touching.
It seems that way. The problem is twofold. Number one, obviously you're in a war zone, and so the roads have been hit very heavily by Russia invading, and then Ukraine countering and pushing Russian forces back out. So the roads are an absolute shipwreck, and they weren't great to begin with. And secondly, because it is remote, it's not like America, for example, where you have this wonderful interstate highway system and everything like that there. The distances that we travel round trip, we travel between 300 and 400 kilometers in any day delivering stuff. And so that is, the limit of which we can do distance wise, given a calendar day, simply because of the conditions and the environment in which we're delivering in.
Wow. So obviously, you've kind of spoke to me before that just cellular or internet access is very limited in those areas. Navigating that kind of environment, since there's, obviously very little internet or no internet in most areas. Do you use guides? How do you get to these remote areas that, most people never heard of?
Sure. When you leave the city Kharkov here in the east and head southward or southeastward or northward for that matter, but specifically southward, which is where the bulk of the counteroffensive is going on, the nearest major village from here is a village called Chuguyev, and that's only about 25 miles from here. The edge of the village of Chuguyev is literally where phone service and cell service and data service stops. And so for the next 5 hours or 6 hours, you're completely blacked out. There is no coverage of any kind. So we have secured a Starlink system and sat phones, and we download all of our navigation before we leave the metropolitan area and head in those directions. And once we're literally 25 miles away after that, it's black. And, we drive according to the navigation that we have pre-planned and take those routes very slowly out into those areas. Like I said, that they have no electricity, they have no natural gas, they have no running water. They have no phone service, no internet service. They've been literally bombed in the Stone Age in the very literal sense. And so when we take 4x4s in there full of food bags and humanitarian, we are the first non-military faces that they've seen in over 6 months.
Wow, that's insane. As far as, let's say, before you all show up, and maybe even before the Ukrainian military shows up, what's their food situation there? I mean, I'm sure, food and water, two different things, but just, water, they, probably get it as they can, but are they getting food from the Russians? Are they growing it? Or how are they getting food there?
Okay, great question. Very great question. Out in these areas, because it is so rural, most of the folks are agricultural orientated. So there's no operating stores out there. There's no Walmart, Kmart. There's nothing like that on the east of Ukraine anyway, before the war. So there's no stores that are open, no small little kiosks that are open. There's no pharmacies that are open. Everything is literally bombed to pieces, and there's nothing operating out there. There's no health clinics. There's no health care. There's no doctors. There's nothing. And so during Russian occupation, we were in the large village called Izium, and we had more than multiple sources. Of course, that's the second place where they found mass graves down there in Izium. But we had multiple sources telling us this, the one and same story, that the Russians would come through with a vehicle and pass out bread twice a week.
Wow.
Bread. And they literally fished the little rivers, the little streams. Every dog, every cat, every chicken, anything with 4 feet two wings, anything, all gone.
Man,
A village of 50,000 people shrunk down to less than 10,000 people. And they've got to live, they got to survive. And so anything that had breath in it is now gone, because you have to live, you have to survive on something.
wow. It sounds kind of almost similar to some of the stories I hear in North Korea that, they I mean, the leaves are eaten off the trees because there's no
Yeah.
food.
Yeah.
Wow.
And here just this last month, um, a large Christian charity out of America opened up a field hospital in Izium, and we were part of that launching program. We provided all the translators for that. I went down and translated myself for a week. My daughter was on their surgical team. She came over here, and we saw entirely too many, just dozens of people every day who had been out in the forests gathering mushrooms for food. And of course, Russia has been using banned cluster munitions and aerial mining. And so the forests and the villages and everywhere, strictly civilian areas, are heavily, heavily mined with these cluster bombs all over the place. And so 10-year-old kids, 5-year-old kids, 25-year-old women, doesn't matter. Boom, arm gets blown off, legs get blown off. And that's the danger. But they've got to live. And so they continue to risk literally life and limb out there trying to forage, out there trying to find something to eat. And now that they're liberated, of course, that is changing. But up until the liberation, it was absolutely catastrophic.
Wow. And I just like to point out one thing as far as the anti-personnel mines. Russia's the only one using those, correct? Because Ukraine does not stock those or have
Correct.
those.
We don't stock them. We don't stock those. And I know for a fact, from first person, I know this is a fact, first person, because I am a official a chaplain for the Ukrainian Armed Services, and the Foreign Legion, the volunteer battalions, anyone who is tasked amongst the Ukrainian military with placing landmines, any type of mines, they are GPS located when they're put in the ground, when they're placed. They're instantly GPS located and put into a Ukrainian military database. So those are tracked and those are accounted for. Russia, on the other hand, continues to lob over here phosphorus bombs, which obviously are, grossly just a horrific. And then the cluster bombs and anti-personnel bomblets that they're just dropping by the thousands all over villages. It is, but it's not new. I hate to say that,
Yeah.
Castles. It's not new. They've been doing this since 2014. The world has stood by and watched. The UN is absolutely impotent. They have refused to do anything about it. It's just now there's more world attention on it. But Ukrainians have been suffering under war crimes and Russia's crimes against humanity here for 8 years already.
Yeah, I've never been in a war zone or anything like that, but I can try to imagine. I can't, and yeah, I mean, just I've seen. I mean, the Russians are blowing themselves up on their own anti-personnel mines to give you kind of an idea. Just those that are listening, I mean, they're everywhere, and um, could you talk a little more about the upcoming humanitarian situation this winter? Because from what you described to me, it was something that we haven't probably seen since World War II.
Yeah. The upcoming humanitarian crisis, I describe as one being of biblical proportion, in the sense that Ukraine very soon will enter into its typical, very deep winter cycle. And in February here in eastern Ukraine, especially, February temperatures drop down to minus 25, minus 30 degrees Fahrenheit during February. And so with innumerable villages without gas, without electricity, without heat, without water, when these type of temperatures set in, when the snow's too deep for us, for example, to get into these villages and take food supplies out to these people, no clinics operating, no pharmacies operating. We saw so many deaths in February, March, and April of this year under Russian occupation because there's no pharmacy, so there's no medicine. So people get sick, the sickness turns into pneumonia, and pneumonia, bang, they check out. So between the soon-to-be inavailability of food sources in these villages, combined with lack of pharmacology, medicines, or medical care, it's going to be a two-prong assault against Ukrainian citizens in that they won't have the food to maintain any reasonable level of health, and they won't have any pharmacology or access to medicines or medical care should, and they do, obviously their people get sick, living in the conditions that they're having to live in. So we are very concerned. And I think the UN and governments besides the United States, Europe must stand up, must get involved in this and prepare before it turns into a humanitarian nightmare, because it'll absolutely just completely come off the rails.
Yeah, the fact that, you all won't be able to even get out there, that's just, I'm sure you all are just a breath of life and fresh air when you show up, because they haven't seen anybody, as you said, for, over 6 months, and they won't be able to see you over the winter. And you were talking about the water situation with me earlier. What's that going to be like over the winter, or even right now?
Well, over the winter, we can look back on February and March of this year as to what it was like. Clean water sources are simply non-existent. And so their water sources range from either some local river that may or may not be particularly clean, by any standard, to drink from, but they do, because you have to drink what you've got available, or snowfall, which is another good source, obviously, of water. But water is very, very, very scarce, and so we often meet people in these villages when we take humanitarian supplies out to them. They say, "Don't give us rice, don't give us macaroni, don't give us anything that requires water, because we have so little of it."
Wow, I didn't think about that part. That'd be difficult. And you were saying, even though these areas are liberated, utilities to them won't be restored for quite a while. Could you touch more on that, please?
Yeah. Considering the remote ruralness of the county around Kharkov, that is surrounded by Russia, all along the county line, we are bordered with Russia all along the east. And so the electrical grid is down. The cell towers were taken out when Russia occupied, because they don't want people on their phones giving away positions and troop movements and troop numbers and things like that. So the first thing Russia did was take out the cell phone grid, and they're still out. And it just really comes down to two things. Number one, the logistics of getting the repair people in to those areas to begin to reconstruct power grids and cell grids and things like that. So number one, the logistics is a real challenge. And secondly, hate to say it, the finances. Ukraine can continue to spend its money on defense in trying to maintain this war, or they can start spending that money to put in electricity. Well, that's a hard call, but the reality is you can go without electricity, but it's really tough to go without the things that you have to have to maintain a fighting force and trying to repel Russia's terrorism.
And the thing is, even if you did repair the electricity, there's no telling that the Russians just wouldn't go and bomb it again. I mean, kind of.
Well, they've been doing that. I hate to say it, they've been doing that. They've been targeting our infrastructure all across the nation here for, I think, 2 weeks now. And so we have rolling brownouts nationwide, depending on where you're at. But the time changes. It's usually 4 hours a day at some point during a 24-hour period. Every city, every place all across Ukraine is without power.
Wow. I mean,
because they're trying to lessen the load on the grid so they can try to repair the stuff that Russia continues to bomb.
Yeah. Trying to think of. I mean, is there anything else on the humanitarian side you'd like to touch that you think is super pressing, or you think we've covered that pretty well?
No, I think we've done real well with that, Castles. I think that it's important. It's important for people to understand that you give, for example, you give to a place like the Red Cross, and I'm just going to call them out publicly. They have on paper documented they have literally wasted on themselves, buying vehicles and apartments and stuff, offices for over $1 billion with a capital B. Over $1 billion have been absolutely wasted. And so, part of the humanitarian issue is the fact that people that are giving, they're giving to the wrong sources. They're giving to places that are high line, but they don't understand that 20 cents on the dollar actually makes it out to the person, and the rest is consumed internally. So food-wise, humanitarian-wise, hygiene items, medicine, these in medical care, these are the cornerstone things that are needed by anybody. You, me, and the Ukrainians out in these villages and small towns, and just the impossibility or extreme difficulty in having access to any of those things, whether it is staple foods, clean water, any kind of water actually, or any type of pharmacology, any type of medicine, continues to be an extreme challenge and will only become much more difficult as winter itself sets in here.
Sure. And since I know I'm going to get asked a lot in the comments when I post this, do you have like a top 2 or top 3 charities that, in your opinion, do actually do a good job with their money and getting it out to the people who need it and don't waste it like the Red Cross or other organizations have?
Yeah, I can give you a couple. I will write them to you when the podcast is over.
Appreciate it.
I do want to give a shout out to a couple, if that's okay. I do want to give a shout out to World Central Kitchen. Now, they don't deliver out to the villages, okay? So let's don't mistake that. But what they are doing is they're bringing in volumes out east, unlike anybody else. Unfortunately, that's as far as it goes, and so it doesn't go actually out to the people. But they are bringing in a lot of stuff, and World Central Kitchen is doing a great job, and I think they should be recognized for it. Other places like Samaritan's Purse, the American-based Christian organization, they too have brought in over 6,000 metric tons of food supplies. That is a phenomenal amount of food. It is. And that is, again, based upon the generosity of Americans and other people around the world that give to them. And I can tell you firsthand that they are transforming. I'll say it that way. They are transforming their partnerships to ensure that they're dealing with organizations that are in fact getting the supplies to the people in the villages. And so here just a couple of days ago, we received 10 metric tons from them because they understand that we have GPS trackers. They can see exactly the villages we're taking it to, and they recognize that our organization, just for example, blow my own horn, it's just the way it is. We are actually out there in those places where there are no other government non-government organizations delivering food. So the list will be short, but I'll give you some names after the podcast is over.
I really appreciate that, and thank you for shouting them out because uh, kind of something I've heard before is people do great work sometimes, but encouraging people is just as important. And so, thank you for
Yeah.
shouting them out. Um, I guess one other thing I kind of want to touch on is in the past month or two, I'm sure the situation slash war has changed a lot recently for you. And how could
Yeah.
you kind of touch on that?
Sure. Two things I believe are responsible for the change regarding the what we call the counteroffensive that Ukraine has very, very boldly engaged in. Number one, Russia, one of its 7 strategic goals that they have in this war of terror inside Ukraine is to establish and maintain a land bridge from Rostov, Russia, across Kherson over to Crimea. That is of extreme importance and remains one of their seven strategic objectives. Recognizing that Ukraine was pushing down south back towards Kherson, all across the east here, whether it's in the county of Kharkov along the border, or in what we call Donbass, which is Lugansk and Donetsk counties. Russia pulled back the bulk of their main regular army and sent them down south to bolster their presence along the south to maintain and secure their land bridge. And so that left great gaps and highly depleted numbers here in the east, and therefore Ukraine has very successfully taken back literally hundreds of miles of war front. And secondly, that's attributed to the arrival of Western weapons. Americans in particular have been asking, what about the 60 billion in aid? Well, that's on paper. It hasn't been given to Ukraine yet. That's the problem. It's coming in very, very, very slowly. And so those things that are in fact finally coming in, the 777s, the HIMARS and things, they are able to reach out so much further and therefore much more strategically and accurately repel Russian advancements and push them out of areas. And so these past 5 weeks have been, from a military strategic standpoint, absolutely unbelievable, truly unbelievable. And Ukraine has made advancements at a record pace all across the county of Kharkov, and now down pushing into Donbass, what we call Donbass, and down towards Kherson because of the repositioning of Russian troops. And finally, enough Western weaponry has been coming in to where they're able to use them and use them very effectively.
That's I obviously keep track of it pretty well, but not everybody
Yeah.
does. And thanks for explaining that. Um, One of the things I've noticed is you see, compared to the beginning of the war to now, a lot of the Ukrainian troops you're seeing on videos look very similar to Western troops now, except for carrying either AK-47s or 74s, and some of them are carrying, M4 pattern weapons, modern NATO issued weapons. But their gear, their helmets, their body armor, it all looks very Western now as compared to the beginning of the war. Wasn't? Is that? I mean, obviously the individual soldier is hugely important, equipping them. Has that changed a lot?
Yeah, yes, it has, and that's a good observation that you've made because it's very accurate. Um, very few of the M4s actually have made it into the hands of the common soldier. Ukrainian Airborne has kind of captured all the M4s that America sent over, about I think like 40,000, something like that, very significant number. And the airborne guys took them all, and they've yet to be deployed anywhere. But
Oh my.
yeah, hey, that's their system. Let them run it.
Hmm.
Uh, you know, President Zelensky hasn't called me yet for my advice. So, but yeah, the uniforms and some of their equipment has definitely been upgraded. Here in the East, especially, uh, it's mostly private organizations, NGOs, charity foundations our organization has supplied over 200 bulletproof vests, helmets, and uniforms and non-lethal aid. And so, due to the immense ground level, um, volunteer movement, very much a roots movement. It is doing so well in gathering supplies and equipment for the brave men and women of Ukraine that are fighting and defending their land. So we're seeing, as you've noticed, a result now. More men and women are much better equipped and very much more to a higher Western level. And that includes not just their uniforms and equipment and hardware, that also includes their training. And because there are a few Western-led instructor groups that have been actively training Ukrainian troops and Ukrainian medics, which increases their fighting capability and lowers the overall attrition rate. So there's been some great advancements here lately.
All right, that's awesome and wonderful to hear. And small organizations can do so much, especially when they just, I guess, large numbers of small organizations. That's huge.
Yeah.
One
Yeah.
last question, because I know you're a busy man. Um, I think recently 10,000 Ukrainian troops returned from training in Britain. How
Yeah.
much do you think those 10,000 troops, and I think another 10,000 cycled in, they're cycling them. Um, how much do you think that's going to change the war in the future, having those Western trained soldiers?
Well, I see firsthand these trained men and women. That's the second batch that Great Britain has done. So that makes 20,000 now that have been trained by Great Britain. Um, they make a tremendous difference. Number one, it is force multiplication. One man that is highly trained is worth 5 men that are poorly trained. So even though it's a David and Goliath situation where Russia obviously has a much deeper pocket and much deeper pool of soldiers, numbers of men to draw from, Ukraine is able to multiply their forces by being a better, smarter, better trained fighting unit. Like I said earlier, we have helped a couple private instructor groups that are British, American, Canadian, and combat instructors and combat medical instructors. And so I see them on the training bases, on the firing lines, in the medical courses. And these men come in 50 at a time, 150 at a time for these week-long, 10-day-long, 2-week-long courses. It depends on where we're at here in the East, how many days these men can rotate in and do. But when they leave, you train 100 guys, or Britain did, 10,000 guys. But I mean, you train 100 guys. Those 100 guys have an effect, not just in their own raw number, because now they're 100 guys are probably worth about 400 or 500 guys.
Yeah.
But they're able to now train their comrades. They're able to now train the men next to them. And so again, this force multiplication principle comes into play. Time at one time, okay, maybe 3 months ago, time was on Putin's side. He has the bigger pool of soldiers to draw from. I believe that tide has turned in Ukraine's favor. Time is on Ukraine's side now. And the longer Putin drags this thing out, the harder and harder and harder it's going to be for him to do anything, because Ukraine is becoming better equipped and they're becoming better trained to what we call NATO standards, Western standards of a warfare, both for tactical fighting as well as medical. So CASELS, I can tell you firsthand from the men and women that I know that have come through training courses by Western instructors, their fighting proficiency and capability and their medical proficiency is infinitely higher than it was before. And their attrition numbers are falling, and they're falling like a rock, and that's a great thing. So we want the war to end. We want Russia to go home. But should they continue to stay and fight, it's going to be harder. Every day that goes by, it's going to be harder and harder and harder for Russia to do anything, to accomplish anything, because every week that goes by, there's more and more Ukrainian troops that are trained and equipped, and therefore they become a much more efficient fighting force.
Thank you for that synopsis. That's awesome and really paints a great picture. And I'll just touch on one thing. I mean, having trained soldiers is amazing, but having medics that know how to, stabilize casualties quickly and bring them back, to stabilizing points safely, and they survive. That's one soldier that didn't die.
Correct.
And America in World War II had the best, medics, and so we had more wounded than anybody else, but we had fewer deaths, and so it's just that's very important, especially in a war that's kind of in a war of attrition right now. Well, I will let you go because I know you have a lot to do. Thank you so much, Doc, for this, and you have a great day.
Thank you, sir. All right, man. Thank you so much.
Sure. Bye.
All right. Bye-bye.